Lawrence Krauss, Foundation Professor in the School of Earth and Space Exploration in the Physics Department, Co-Director of the Cosmology Initiative, and Inaugural Director of the Origins Initiative at Arizona State University. International known theoretical physicist, previous attendee at Beyond Belief, major force in Doing Science Debate 2008, and a generally good guy. Lawrence Krauss.
Thank you, Roger. Okay, well, I don't want to thank Roger like the other speakers, but I'd like to acknowledge him. Because unlike some of the other speakers who were actually asked to talk about their day job stuff, I agreed to talk whatever Roger wanted me to talk about. And I found that out last night, so I thank him for that. But the good thing is, because of that, I could sort of respond to some of the things I've been hearing about during the meeting, which is useful and unusual. I will talk about, rather than candles, I'm going to talk about some of the problems, because I know some of my colleagues are going to talk about some of the solutions. And I've really been asked to talk about science and politics, which I do spend a little bit of time on. And I don't have anything to say about thinking or the brain except for this quote, probably, which is that the message of this talk, if there is any, is that science is needed now more than ever to address political problems, but I see no evidence that it's having any great impact. And I'll talk about some of the challenges and why. So the title was this. I want to talk about, first I'd like to talk about, just reinforce the notion, which is really speaking to the converted here, about what are some of the key issues that, well, Einstein gave that quote when he was talking about the discovery, or the application of nuclear weapons, that the existence of nuclear weapons changed everything in the world, but it didn't change our way of thinking. That was in 1946, and now, more than 60 years later, it still hasn't changed anything about the way nations think about peace and war in nuclear times. And so, having to do with nuclear weapons, it's clear that sort of a scientific mode of thinking hasn't taken over. But there are lots of other areas where we are in incredible need of an empirical approach to public policy, and that seems to be lacking. I also want to point out that there are very important connections between science and politics that are not often realized, and particularly in the political arena. One has to do, right now we're in hard financial times, and science, as I'll argue, is in fact an easy target. But science has been vitally important and will be vitally important for the economy of our future. And here are some examples that came from the National Academy study, Rising Above the Gathering Storm, about public investments in science and technology and the annualized returns, and basically claiming that half the nation's growth in GDP was based on scientific and engineering achievements during the last half century. And at that same time, a follow-up report from the National Academy pointed out several problems, particularly in the United States. The World Economic Forum dropped the U.S. from 1st to 7th place in the ranking of nations' preparedness to benefit from advances in information technology. U.S. companies spent 3 times more on litigation than on research. Over the past 20 years, the number of engineers, physical scientists, and mathematicians graduating with bachelor's degrees in the U.S. has declined by 18%. And adjusted for inflation, the U.S. spent about 1/5 less on research in 2000 than it did 15 years ago. And in fact, we spent less every single year for the last 5 years on research than we had before. But it's not just, science is important, I would argue, not just for its technological benefits and its economic benefits. And we scientists, I think, need to stress this more, that it's of cultural benefit. And one part of what politics is supposed to do is preserve our culture in some way. And my favorite quote was from Robert Wilson, one of Leon's predecessors as director of Fermilab, the first director. And he was asked by a congressional committee if the machine that they were building would aid in the defense of the nation. And he said, no, but it'll help keep the nation worth defending. And that's the important point, I think, is that science is really not properly understood as a vital and vibrant part of our culture. And we scientists have to, I think, do a better job of convincing people of that. At the same time, in responding a little bit to Sam about the fact that certain things may be actually more valuable than other things, science is I think, particularly appropriate to apply to politics. It has an ethos that's very positive. and again is not, I think, well understood. And Richard Feynman put it as well as anyone. He said the only way to have real success in science is to describe the evidence very carefully without regard to the way you feel it should be. If you have a theory, you must try and explain what's good about it and what's bad about it equally. In science, you learn a sort of standard integrity and honesty. And that ethos of science, which involves honesty and full disclosure. You can't just pick the data. You have to disclose the data that agrees with your theory and the data that doesn't agree with the theory. And another aspect of science, which is of vital importance, which again I think is not understood among the public, is the complete anti-authoritarian of science. People are often referred to as scientific authorities. There are no scientific authorities, scientific experts, but there's no one whose authority is not subject to question by the lowliest, you pick it, graduate student, undergraduate student, whatever, tenured professor. I would argue that any of these things, if they applied in Washington, would make it a better place. Okay? And science can be useful in that regard. Now, in fact, a very good description of the role that science should play in the political arena actually came from a speech from a former president, the father of our current president, in fact, who said to the National Academy of Sciences, "Science, like any field of endeavor, relies on freedom of inquiry, and one of the hallmarks of that freedom is objectivity. Now more than ever, on issues ranging from climate change to AIDS research to genetic engineering to food additives, government relies on the impartial perspective of science for guidance." And it's hard to think of a better description of what that relationship should be. Now let's fast forward to the current administration. And a quote from a representative of the current administration who said, "This administration looks at the facts and reviews the best available science based on what's right for the American people." Okay? You get the little subtle difference there. Okay? This is, first you decide what's right, and then you pick the science that agrees with what's right. Okay? And that's, of course, wrong. And as a result, Chris, among others here, has written extensively on this, but if you look at key areas of broad areas of the way science should be interfacing with our public policy, there's been scientific distortion, misrepresentation, and bad policy. And I'm not going to go into all that here. But that attitude has crushed what was once a more productive relationship between science and government. And now, I want to talk about some of the reasons for that, some of the problems that we have to face. And there are cultural problems in this country. In fact, it was really brought home to me recently. I was in England, and someone gave me a 10-pound note. And Charles Darwin is on the back of the 10-pound note in England. On the back of the US dollar is a pyramid with an eye on it. Okay? And it gives you some sense of the cultural problems that we face. Now, part of the problem, actually, in Beyond Belief 1, I had for me at least, a very useful and long discussion with Richard Dawkins, which we later turned into an article that appeared in Scientific American. And I argued to him, part of my difference with Richard about the way we treat religion, and probably with Sam, is well, as I said in the piece, as long as the tenets of faith go beyond reason, i.e. go beyond issues that could be settled by evidence or lack of evidence, faith lies in the realm of human activity that has little to do with reason. Now, if this realm was restricted to religion alone, I would agree with Richard's argument that we should try and sculpt religion. But of course, it's not unique to religion alone. It's basically the heart of almost all human activity. Humans aren't rational beings at a fundamental level. Like or not, a central facet of much of what it means to be a human is irrational. And every one of us has to believe in many impossible things before breakfast to get up and go to work in the morning. And we learned in the last session, for example, we see that people don't always act rationally. It depends on many factors that are part of being human. And I think, was it bounded rationality? Was it Sam who talked about bounded rationality? This is the bound of rationality at some level. The reason I'm presenting it here is it doesn't, I think, just apply to religion. I think it applies to politics. And politics is not a rational activity. And that's part of the problem. People don't just make decisions based on rational, what should be rational empirical arguments. And that always, I think, impacts upon the relationship of what scientists would view as clearly the right policy and what actually happens. And there's a big paradox. Just about the time we launched Science Debate 2008, I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal, and I made the point, which I think is clear, that basically every major challenge that our political leaders are going to deal with in this next century, every major political issue has a scientific basis. It's hard to think of one that isn't related to science. And at the same time, the part of the paradox is that in spite of the fact that that's true, when we in Science Debate put together programs that we thought were very attractive to have presidential debates or forums, just open discussions or private discussions with each candidate on science technology, 2 times when things were very close, the candidates instead decided to have forums on faith. Okay, there were 2 forums, as you probably remember, from the presidential candidates on this vitally important issue of faith, which won't have any impact at all on the future of this country. Okay, but science will. But there wasn't a single forum on that. But at the same time, you know, people perceive a complete disinterest in science in many ways, but we have to balance that with this notion that, in fact, everyone at a gut level realizes that science and technology are the solution. And the example I want to give of that is that I've used several times is the avian flu. President Bush said, when it comes to evolution and intelligent design, he said both sides should be taught so students know what the debate is all about. Okay? Now, when the avian flu became a problem, President Bush and every single person in his administration said we have to determine how fast it's mutating from birds to humans. Okay? Not a single person said it's been designed to kill us. Just forget about it. Okay? And so at some level, everyone, no matter what they say, they realize that the solution to the problems is scientific. And that's this paradox that we tend to ignore in our political arena. We ignore science even though at some gut level people realize it is necessary. And I just want to depress you a little bit with some facts and figures. Every year the National Science Foundation does a study of scientific literacy. And this is 2001, which is one of my favorite studies. So in that one, to give you an example, 53% of American adults were unaware that the last dinosaur died before the first human result. One of our vice presidential candidates is on that list, at least one. The next one is always one of my favorites. 50% of American adults knew that the Earth orbits the sun and takes a year to do it. Okay? Now, every year since that survey's been done, 50% of the American public get it wrong. And I like to say I know who they vote for. But in any case, the point, it was such a scary statistic, I went back to the survey, and I thought it was a trick question. And the question was, the Earth orbits the sun and takes a year to do it, true or false? Okay, every year, 50% get that wrong. This was a banner year because it was the first time in the history of that survey that more than 50% of American adults claimed to know that human beings as we know them today developed from earlier species of animals. It was the only time that more than 50% of the American public claimed to know that. That, of course, has clearly gone away. You know, there's many examples, but for example, in a large 2007 survey, 60% of American adults stated their belief that God created humans in their present form less than 10,000 years ago, in spite of the fact that that's just nonsense. Forget the God part, the 10,000 years ago part. Okay, so part of the problem is cultural. Part of the problem is a basic level of irrationality. But a huge part of the problem is ignorance. It's the fact that people don't have any basic understanding of what science is. And I'll come to that, back to that. There's another problem I want to talk about that I've come to appreciate a little more spending a lot of time with journalists, both in my public activities and also more recently in the context of Science Debate 2008. There is an institutional problem between journalism and science. There are several institutional problems. Well, the first problem is pretty simple. Most journalists are uncomfortable about scientific matters, and they won't make pronouncements. I was very pleased when finally a story came out by Corey Dean in the New York Times a year or two ago that said evolution is the basis of modern biology. Didn't say many scientists believe, okay? Because every single time that you try and say something like that, you're the editor, if not the writer, has to qualify it. No, you would never see people say, most historians believe the Holocaust happened. Okay? But when it's equally clear facts, journalists are really hesitant to state them as facts. Okay? But there's another problem, too, and that journalists are trained to always see two sides to every story. And if any of you talk to journalists, you often know that they always want to know the names of people who might disagree, etc. And that's fine, okay? Except what really makes science particularly useful is that most times one side is wrong. That's profoundly important. That is not understood. That most times, in fact, science is one of the unique areas of human activity where you can unambiguously say what's wrong. And then you just don't talk about it anymore. The Earth isn't flat. Go around it. End of story. You don't need critical thinking classes to discuss this question. And the fact is that you can always find a PhD to say whatever you want. And if you feel the need to present two sides to every story, you'll always find the other side, even when it's nonsense. And you'll present it, whether it's global climate change or evolution, you'll present it as if it's a controversial issue because you can always find one person to say something on the other side. But in fact, in science, we throw out what's wrong and we don't talk about it anymore. We don't know what's right, but we know what's unambiguously what's wrong. And that's a vitally important issue. But there's an institutional barrier that I hadn't really appreciated that has come up in a number of areas, and that we, as we tried to get science debate covered, it took off tremendously among scientific institutions, scientists, and very significant groups around the country when we tried to get journalists to cover this. And what we discovered was something, the question is, who covers science and politics in papers? And the answer is nobody. And there's a reason. Science reporters are quite interested in this. But when science reporters try and get a story on politics, it's on the political pages, and the science reporter isn't allowed to write about it. So you go to the political reporters, but the political reporters have absolutely no interest or knowledge or comfort level with the science. So the people who really want to write about these issues are generally not allowed by the editors to write in the sections of the paper where it should be. So that disconnect between science and politics is kind of institutionalized. And it continues to be that way. We found this. I'm now an advisor to one of the presidential campaigns. And most recently, for example, 61 Nobel laureates just endorsed that candidate and tried to get that in newspapers around the country. And I don't know a single one that has published that fact. The other problem is, and this was brought up to me in discussions with the science advisor to the current president, science doesn't have a constituency for a lot of reasons. That politicians tend to ignore science for a bunch of reasons. And one is that scientists don't vote as a bloc. You don't have to necessarily appeal to, you don't have to appease scientists. If your particular institution doesn't fund science, or your particular administration, scientists are not going to not vote Democrat or not vote Republican because of that as a rule. Unlike many other groups that can be appealed to on single issue matters. It's also an extremely easy budget target. In hard times, science appears to have no constituency outside of scientists. And that's disastrous. For an example is every single politician in the country essentially has endorsed the America Competes Act. The Republicans, the Democrats, the administration, the Congress has all voted in favor of an America Competes Act which would finally refund science, which I remind you has been funded at a level that has decreased over the last 5 years continuously every year. Everyone's in favor of it. But it hasn't happened once. Because every time there's a budget crisis, it's easy to just put science on a flat level. In fact, that's what's happening this year. There's a continuing resolution this year that's been passed to fund everything that's non-defense at the 2008 level, which was already a disaster for science, so they put supplements in the 2008 budget for science. But now in 2009, when these programs are funded at 2008 level, it will mean cuts across the board. Okay? In spite of the fact that every single politician has argued that they're in favor of finally trying to become competitive. And and as I said, we couldn't. The fact that Nobel laureates recently talked about innovation, no interest among journalists. There is an essential irrationality that I think is vitally important to understand the political arena. I think Sarah Palin, for better or worse, exemplifies this, not just in herself. I mean, obviously she's ignorant, uninterested, illiterate, and unqualified. But the fact that people review supposedly intelligent people can respond differently. The fact that people can actually make a claim, as David Brooks did in the New York Times, that she was remarkable, indicates that at some level people have and there are other groups that have also said that, that at some level the way we react to simple statements is, at a political level is inherently irrational. And intelligent people respond in incredibly unintelligent ways. And I'm kind of amazed, for example, one example, during the debate, she argued, as she has before, that global climate change is not human-induced. Okay, she's fine. She can accept that fact. Interestingly enough, however, she argued very strongly she wants to, in favor of addressing human production of greenhouse gases. What's the rationale for that? Okay, everyone was happy to hear that she agreed with John McCain on this, but what's the rationale? If you don't believe it's human-induced, then it doesn't have to be addressed by addressing human production of greenhouse gases. Okay, but that fundamental rationality, okay. Yeah, I'll go for 3 or 4 minutes. Is that all right? Okay. We heard about valued-colored glasses. I think it's a key. It hit me reading the paper today, of course, the obvious fact that human self-interest is strongly more important often, or perceived self-interest, than your awareness of the world, whether it's group cohesion or the fact that you're present-oriented, as we heard this morning. This was a quote I read in today's San Diego Union Tribune. So this was someone who's saying it's hard to vote Democratic when you're a business person because of perception, that you have more money and you could do better as a business person if there's a Republican administration. We finally decided to not vote on money. And I think that's the other important issue, is that people don't vote on what's right for the world. They vote on what's right for themselves, and that often is totally unrelated to what may be right for the world. And the good news is, I anticipate I may be running late, so I put a little thing here where I could jump to another slide, and I'm going to jump to another slide. And now I'm near the end. The last thing I wanted to mention is a very important thing, that there is among the public a huge fear of science. And there's lots of examples of this in the literature, in particular evolution and creationism. But I'm on the second last slide, and the last slide is the next one, Roger, just so you know, so stop staring at me. The First Amendment, as Eugenie Scott said, the First Amendment protects against the government, establishment, of religion, but that doesn't mean it will protect against bad science. The same, forget about religion, it's the same for everything. We have constitutional amendments that protect against lots of things, but they don't protect us against bad science. And we have this huge problem that, and I think as scientists, we need to realize this problem exists, and that's part of what I'm talking about. And so the last thing is sort of what's the candle? I don't know if there's a candle. Oh, I guess, well, as I'll say, the candle is that scientists have to become more involved in a vital way. They can't, in fact, Nita was talking about this in the context of the law, but in every single way, in the political arena, scientists have to get more involved. And the real problem is ignorance. And I think ignorance, it fosters those two things that totally hurt the political process and public policy. But the ignorance of science that people have are not what scientists think is ignorance. Scientists want to talk about time travel or the Large Hadron Collider or whatever, but the things that people don't realize about science are the following, at a much more basic level. They don't realize that science is more than just a story in which you can pick parts and leave out other parts. It's like any other story. I don't agree with this part of science, so I won't listen to it. I just pick that part of science. But it's not a story. It's a story with implications and consistency, and you can't just pick and choose. The fact that science really underpins almost all political decisions is something that is not recognized at all. And finally, the fact that science is not a threat to our morality, our ethics, and, Sam notwithstanding, our faith. And I think these are the things we really have to work at, explain to the public if we ever expect science to play a rational role in public policy. Thank you.